Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. To a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Let's picture it now. A cloister wrapped in ivy, lightly humming with the distant chant of monks who aren't particularly in tune and don't seem too worried about it. The air smells of beeswax and stale lentils. Somewhere in the corner of this eternal Tuesday, a peasant named Edric is gazing wistfully at a wooden hoe and wondering, again, whether potatoes will ever be invented. Spoiler. No, not yet. Wrong continent. But bless his heart. We begin, not with glory or battle cries, but in the loamy fields where civilization quietly slogged forward, one backache at a time. The era is the early Middle Ages, or as I like to call it, that long nap between Rome and the Renaissance. The plough was still humble, the wheelbarrow a distant glimmer on the horizon, and livestock, as always, utterly unimpressed by humans' efforts to organize anything more complicated than hay. Now, in these early post-Roman days, farming was primarily a team sport, between you, the weather, and a rudely shaped stick. This stick, called an ard, was technically a plough, though using it was akin to combing your field with a large wooden spoon and hoping something got frightened into growing. It scratched the soil rather than turning it over, which meant weeds just laughed at it and sent postcards home. Still, it was better than using your hands, and just about the only upgrade since prehistoric digging sticks. We're talking bleeding edge technology here, pun very much intended. The ard was often pulled by oxen, not because they were efficient or fast, but because horses hadn't yet been told they were supposed to be helpful. Oxen had two speeds, slow and vegetative coma, but they were sturdy, chew-cud like philosophers, and crucially, unlikely to gallop off mid-furrow. As such, Edric and his kin spent most of their waking hours behind the ox, shaping crooked rows in the earth, and occasionally wondering if the church would object to cursing under one's breath. Speaking of breath, let's talk about that sweet medieval weather. Farming in those days was delightfully unpredictable. Some years it rained every Tuesday and never again. Others it was too sunny, which sounds nice until your barley falls over from heat stroke. Climate was mostly governed by what we now call the Little Ice Age's clingy older sibling, the early medieval warm period, a name that only historians, meteorologists, and confused hobby bakers appreciate. And through all of this, the humble peasantry endured, fueled mainly by gruel, prayer, and an ever-present suspicion that nobles got all the good mud. Of course, land was divided in a system known as the three-field rotation, which sounds deceptively like a Renaissance dance, but was in fact a revolutionary method of not running out of edible dirt. Fields were split into thirds, one for autumn crops like wheat, one for spring crops like oats, and one where the land did absolutely nothing. A concept modern couch potatoes instinctively respect and understand. Tools were handmade, often with more enthusiasm than skill. Wooden ploughs, wooden rakes, wooden shovels, with iron tips if you were lucky or knew someone who owed you a favor. The average medieval farmer could identify 37 types of mud by smell alone, and they all had names like Harold's Regret or Sunday Surprise. Yet despite all odds, crops somehow grew. Not quickly, not easily, not Instagrammably, but they grew. And in a time when even bread was occasionally scandalous, see, the medieval fear of rye ergot hallucinations, a whole separate bedtime story, this was achievement enough. As evening falls on our peasants' unassuming corner of history, the tools are packed away, gently leaned against stone walls whose moss has seniority. A jug of ale is passed around, laughter eked out between chewing and yawning. Someone is humming a tune that predates musical notation, and the scriptorium cat, by the grace of all that is holy, has finally been fed. Tomorrow will bring more of the same. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Imagine yourself lying in a thatched hut, where the roof leaks only when it rains, which is to say all the time, and the air smells faintly of wet straw, sheep, and unrealized ambition. It's the year 787 or thereabouts, and the plough, or as the Anglo-Saxons called it, a sulge, is your best friend, worst enemy, and most complicated relationship. It's also the leading cause of lower back pain in the known world. Congratulations, you're a medieval peasant. Now, for centuries, humans had been scratching at the earth with something between a stick and a strong opinion. But it was around this time, long before Bluetooth headphones or even real thoughts about tooth hygiene, that things began to, ever so sluggishly, improve. How, you ask? With the invention of the heavy plough. That's right, the superstar of medieval tool development was a slightly better plough, breathtaking. See, earlier ploughs, those light scratch ploughs or ard, were perfect for the dry, sandy soils of the Mediterranean. Picture a glorified butter knife dragged through cheesecake. It worked well enough in the south, but once farming slugged its way into the wetter, muddier lands of northern Europe, the ard wasn't so much ploughing as waving politely at the surface of the earth before calling it a day. Enter the heavy plough, with its mighty iron coulter, mouldboard, and soul-crushing weight. This beast didn't just tickle the soil. No, it cut, turned, and flung it aside like a moody teenager flinging laundry across a bedroom. It made farming possible in the thick, clay-heavy soils of places like modern-day Germany, Poland, and East Anglia, regions previously declared too muddy, don't bother, by earlier settlers. Its arrival wasn't a lightning bolt of invention, so much as the slow drizzle of awkward innovation. First came the coulter, a vertical knife that would pre-slice the earth like an appetizer. Then came the ploughshare, which followed behind like an enthusiastic younger sibling, digging in and under. The mouldboard brought up the rear, flipping the soil over dramatically like it had something to prove. To make this mechanical miracle move, you needed more than just one man and a displeased ox. In many cases, it took teams of 8 oxen, all of whom were positively thrilled by the opportunity to trudge through muddy fields all day while belching their personal aromas into the morning mist. This required cooperation, so much so that villages often pooled resources, forming communal ploughing teams, or as they were sometimes called, plough gangs. Yes, that's a real term. Street cred was not included, and so the plough changed agriculture, not like a revolution with fireworks and immediate results, but like a slowly steeping cup of tepid barley water. Over years, decades, maybe a few centuries, yields increased. Populations grew. People had just enough food not to riot, but not so much they were happy about it. The rhythm of life plodded forward, largely behind a pair of oxen who were equally indifferent to both God and progress. Of course, owning oxen, or even the heavy plough itself, wasn't something every peasant could manage. In fact, peasants had about as many ploughs as they had horses, which was to say, not many. Most of the time, the equipment belonged to a local lord, who rented it out in exchange for fees, favours, or fields full of toiling vassals pretending not to resent him. And about those fields, Another major shift was prompted by the plough's heavy appetite. It required straight, open expanses, not the patchy, kaleidoscopic arrangements of older farms. Thus emerged the open field system, with its long, narrow strips shared among villagers. Imagine your neighbour's turnips right next to your barley, and try not to eye their furrows for signs of suspiciously bountiful yield. It was cooperation, yes, but also gossip-intensive. If Edric down the row wasn't ploughing deep enough to hit decent subsoil, his potato-like experiments would flop, and the whole village would hear about it by dawn. They'd say, "Edric's got a shallow bottom," and everyone knew what that meant, agriculturally of course. Still, the heavy plough didn't just shape soil, it shaped society. Long hours in the field encouraged innovation in scheduling naps while appearing productive, and even early songs of protest, known widely as groaning while working. The plough was transformative in that deeply unglamorous, quietly powerful way that history so often prefers, the sort that shifts the world an inch at a time until nobody remembers what it looked like before. And as the seasons churned and the soil flipped again and again under the rhythmic push of iron and hoof, the world beneath the furrows began to change, one rut at a time. Let's rest here for a bit as the oxen chew their endless cud and the morning fog settles like lukewarm porridge over the land. Our next stop lies just ahead, beyond the horizon of slightly less terrible tools, somewhere past the grassy silence of the 9th century European countryside, where sheep lived their peaceful woolen lives and monks debated the theological implications of crop rotation. Something utterly unremarkable was happening, and that something was manure. Yes, dear listener, it is time to talk about what truly fertilized the fields long before fertilizers came in plastic bags with rainbows on the packaging. You see, the very soul of medieval agriculture was rich, squishy, and smelled alarmingly like community involvement. Because back then, you didn't just toss your waste away. You carried it, with solemn responsibility, to the fields. This was the beginning of a revolution quietly bubbling beneath noble feet: organic fertilizer. Every peasant farm had its cadre of cows, goats, pigs, and that one chicken who acted like he owned the place. Their contributions, daily applications of Mother Nature's least glamorous gift. In the absence of scientific understanding, farmers relied on centuries of anecdotal knowledge and suspicious smells to guide their efforts. Trial and error was the method. Sometimes just trial, occasionally just error. What most people didn't realize is that mixing animal droppings with straw and letting it stew in the sun produced compost that practically sang love songs to barley and rye. This primal blend was affectionately slopped into wooden barrows and wheeled onto the earth with the joy of someone gifting the soil a very personal bouquet. It may not seem romantic now, but in an age without TikTok, this was essentially their version of an unboxing video. But transporting this precious cargo required tools. And for a blissfully long while, the favorite conveyance was the humble hay fork, ancestor of today's pitchfork, and distant cousin of that fancy salad fork you only use once a year. These early hay forks were carved lovingly from wood, often by hand, using methods passed down from generation to generation of very practical people with more calluses than patience. The three-pronged fork was perfectly designed, not for drama or glory, but for efficiently moving hay, straw, and, when needs must, moderately unpleasant bundles of manure. If you were lucky, your hay fork was made from ashwood, strong yet flexible. If you were unlucky, it may have been willow, which bent like a bard's morals at a noble feast. To wield a hay fork was to take part in a timeless ballet of spreading, turning, scooping, and occasionally swearing, especially when the wind changed direction. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, but there was nobility in the rhythm. Stab, lift, toss. The choreography of sustenance, performed daily by peasants and farmhands with very little sleep and even less appreciation. And yet, as ordinary as it was, the hayfork represents a fascinating threshold in the history of tools, a step away from the blunt simplicity of rocks and sticks toward carefully crafted implements designed for very specific tasks. Medieval innovation, after all, wasn't all siege engines and suspicious potions. Sometimes it was deciding that 2 tines weren't enough, and 4 made the thing too fussy. But for all its dependable plodding utility, the hayfork had natural enemies, mostly in the form of the medieval village pig, which, although small of stature, was gifted with the cunning of a minor warlord and a distinct disregard for boundaries. Pens were flimsy, gates were suggestions, and so the hayfork was just as often a pig-herding prod as it was a farming implement. Its versatility bordered on poetic. Meanwhile, the wiser farmers, realizing that fields were not self-stirring cauldrons of fertility, began experimenting with timing, applying manure before winter, applying it during spring, mixing types, layering it like a lasagna only a cow could love. Subtle agronomic alchemy that passed through generations not by parchment, but word of mouth, over warm ale and durably tragic songs. You might imagine then a dun-coloured morning with frost edging the thatch rooftops, and a sleepy farmer rising before the sun, trundling out toward his small square of land, hayfork in hand, breath frosting in the still air. He is half dreaming and entirely practical. The buzzards overhead know the smell and steer clear, as do the nobility, busy in their parchment castles. This man, this hayfork, this quiet burden of waste and wonder, they are feeding a nation, one scoop at a time. As we leave him to his misty morning work, hayfork clunking gently on a wheelbarrow rim, it's time we looked a bit more closely at soil itself, that unloved, downtrodden, beautifully complex patchwork beneath our feet. What was it made of? What did medieval people think it was made of? And what secrets might it still be hiding in its humble, squishy depths? A long time ago, sometime around the 10th century, when cows still held most of the economic power and the term morning commute involved actual hooves, there emerged a curious little moment in European farming history. It was the rise of the moldboard plow. Now, before you leap from your pillow with unbridled excitement, let's temper expectations. The moldboard plow is, strictly speaking, not the sort of headline-grabbing innovation that inspires sonnets or season finales. But in its quiet, soil-turning way, it reshaped medieval agriculture, both literally and figuratively, and brought a new, slightly more symmetrical groove to the European countryside. Let's take a moment and picture it. A misty morning, dew still clinging to the thatched roof of a timber-framed hut. A peasant, probably named Edric or Leofwine, or some other impressively Anglo-Saxon name, yawns his way into consciousness. He throws on a tunic made of something that somehow manages to itch and sag at the same time. And outside waits his trusty ox, about as enthusiastic as an overworked bus driver, who knows what's coming next. The old scratch plough, called the ard, had been the standard tool in earlier centuries. A simple wooden beam dragged through the topsoil. It was basically agriculture's equivalent of finger painting. Earnest, serviceable, and not terribly precise. It scratched the earth in shallow lines, leaving soil sort of nudged, not actually overturned. Fine for the dry, sandy soils of the Mediterranean. Not so impressive in Europe's heavier, wetter soils, which stubbornly resisted the ard like a toddler refusing greens. Enter the mouldboard. This was the medieval aha moment. A curved board attached to the side of the plough that actually turned over the soil, slicing it, lifting it, and flipping it with all the elegance of a practiced pancake chef. Suddenly, fields weren't just being scratched, they were being properly stirred and aerated, making cozy pockets for seeds and suffocating pesky weeds with a blanket of fresh earth. The mouldboard was the kind of satisfying improvement that made peasants pause, squint at the field, and mutter, "Well, that's new," before returning to their usual state of quiet hardship. And with this innovation came another slow revolution, the rise of the heavy plough team. You see, the mouldboard wasn't messing around. It cut deeper, worked harder, and needed muscle, not your standard one-ox operation. This was at least an 8-ox kind of day, preferably yoked in pairs with enough combined strength to make modern tractors feel nervously watched. These teams lumbered through fields in impressive unity, guided by farmers hollering encouragement in a range of early dialects, half of which probably sounded more like motivational throat clearing. This shift from lighter to heavier ploughing required changes in everything: more coordination, stronger breeds of oxen, shared ownership arrangements, and the occasional neighbourly feud over who left hoofprints where. But the mouldboard plough was more than just efficient. It subtly shifted the map of medieval life. Regions with thick, damp soil, once the neglected cousins of Europe's sun-drenched south, began producing more grain. This meant more bread, fewer famines, slightly plumper children, and a marginally happier clergy. Population edges ticked upward, which in medieval math meant 1 or 2 more healthy teeth per village. And just like that, Europe's economic centre of gravity began tilting northward. It's a quiet, muddy tale of slow persistence and shared oxen. Hardly the stuff of epic sagas, but profoundly world-shaping in its own sleepy way. Now, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the sheer craftsmanship involved. These ploughs were slowly improved by generations of smiths and carpenters, who, though completely unaware of anything called engineering, adjusted angles, added wheels, and innovated by trial, error, and probably several broken thumbs. No patents were filed, no TED Talks given, but the mouldboard evolved, passing from hand to calloused hand, shaping the landscape one furrow at a time. So the next time you glance at a steaming loaf of bread and think, "Well, that's nice," remember, 1,000 years ago, someone walked behind 8 enormous oxen, just so you could one day spread raspberry jam on something vaguely yeasty. As the mouldboard traced graceful arcs through muddy fields, it also laid the groundwork, quite literally, for what would come next. Villages that grew, trade that sprouted, and medieval backs that ached with slightly more purpose. Speaking of aching backs and muddy paths, brace yourself gently for our next foray. The curious tale of the 3-field system, which, as it turns out, has a plot twist that even wheat didn't see coming. By the turn of the 9th century, as dew still clung lazily to the fields of Christendom, our tale finds itself contemplating a most curious and clanky contraption. The harrow. Oh, the harrow. That most modest of spiky swipes across a soil's sunburnt back. Before the harrow strutted onto the agricultural stage, farmers were thankful just to scratch the surface, literally. Seeds were often scattered with the grace of a sneeze, then left for fate, birds, or an abrupt summer rain to decide their destiny. But the medieval mind, restless, imaginative, and very allergic to starvation, whittled away at the problem. Enter the boron-toothed harrow. Boron, being naturally unavailable in medieval Europe, wasn't actually involved, but let's not let modern chemistry ruin the poetry. Harrows were often made with simple wooden frames and iron teeth. When peasants were feeling especially fancy, the idea was to drag the contraption across the field after sowing, either by human power, if dietary fiber had been high that day, or with the help of a very confused cow. The harrow's job? To tickle the soil just enough to cover the seeds where the plough had already opened up the earth like an upside-down baguette. But this tickling had serious purpose: protection, germination, and cuddly insulation. All while looking like a medieval torture device that lost its ambition. If the plough was the brooding, hard-working older sibling, the harrow was the slightly scattered but enthusiastic younger one, doing its job as best it could, slightly off-center and often covered in clumps of mud. Monasteries, ever the quiet innovators in their not-so-secret quest for better crop yields and better mead, took a shine to the harrow. It proved especially handy in the large-scale cereal production that monks were keen on. Beneath their habits beat the hearts of ambitious agronomists, many of whom kept very detailed logs about soil condition, rainfall, and just how many rock-stabbing outbursts the harrow incurred per acre. This wasn't just field work. It was the sleepy birth of experimental statistics. One particularly patient monk, named Brother Anton of St. Bumbling, reportedly hand-whittled a harrow so wide that it required 3 oxen and the calming hymns of 2 novices just to keep it from veering into hedgerows. Divine intervention was seriously considered when it managed to make a single straight furrow. Interestingly, harrows came in several varieties: spike-toothed, disc-shaped, or made of woven brushwood, depending on what kind of sarcasm the local soil offered. In rocky terrain, iron-toothed harrows performed with all the elegance of someone trying to floss with a rake. In softer loams, they glided as effortlessly as a goose through a pond, albeit a goose that sometimes caught fire from friction. By the high Middle Ages, the harrow was everywhere, sort of the medieval version of a viral dance trend, just less rhythmic and more likely to give splinters. It allowed for marginally better seed coverage, fewer complaints from hungry crows, and an ever so slight uptick in yield, just enough to sustain both peasant table and tax collector's pouch. And so it was that the harrow earned its place in the pantheon of tools that helped cradle medieval civilization towards something vaguely resembling progress, or at the very least, towards slightly less empty pantries in April. Even its sound, wood creaking, metal dragging, occasionally a bitter peasant mumbling about blisters, became a sort of rural lullaby, echoing over the countryside like a lullaby for the land itself. As twilight settled on yet another 9th century field, and the harrow leaned wearily against a fence post carved by generations of backaches, peasants trudged home, knowing the seeds were now tucked under a fine blanket of tilled earth. Would they grow? Maybe. Would the harrow be blamed if they didn't? Almost certainly. But such is the noble lot of medieval farm tools, underappreciated, overused and covered in things that are best left unlabeled. Tomorrow, or perhaps in another dreamier moment, we'll saunter quietly into the age of animal harnesses. Not the snazzy ones for knights' noble steeds, mind you, but the scratchy, utterly unfashionable type that changed everything. Very slowly. As dawn yawned across the English countryside in the early 12th century, something quietly monumental was taking root, though possibly at the barn's back door, where few thought to glance. It wasn't a royal decree, or a scandalous jousting contest. No, it was the subtle rise of a small but revolutionary implement, the harrow. Yes, the harrow. Less famous than the plough, less glamorous than a sword, but far more influential if you were a pea or a patch of barley hoping for a decent place to grow. Now, if the plough was the crust-cutting hero of the field, the harrow was its gentle friend, who came afterward to tuck the soil in like a bedtime story. After the plough had turned the earth with all the delicacy of an ox on a sugar rush, the harrow came along to break up the clods, smooth the surface, and provide a dusty duvet for the seeds to snuggle into. Think of it as medieval agriculture's way of saying, "There, little field, let's make you comfy." Early versions of the harrow were fairly basic. Wooden frames dragged behind oxen, their underside studded with branches, spikes, or occasionally what can only be described as weaponized shrubbery. It was all very rustic. Farmers weren't exactly shopping from a medieval Home Depot catalogue. If they needed a better harrow, they built one, out of whatever happened to be lying around the village that wasn't already being used as a fence, bench, or suspiciously unstable ladder. One popular type was the drag harrow, which looked like a giant wooden comb and acted a bit like a field masseuse with aggressive opinions about soil. Later, iron-tipped teeth were added to ensure a deeper scratch, which sounds unpleasant unless you're a patch of dirt in desperate need of aeration. Meanwhile, other variations like the toothed harrow and the chain harrow ambled into existence, each bringing its own style of soil-taming flair. It was essentially an agricultural version of a spa day, if spa days involved livestock and significant amounts of mud. Interestingly, not all harrows were created equal, and the harrow's evolution teaches us something critical about the spread of ideas in medieval Europe, namely, that nothing spread quickly unless it had wheels, wings, or was a rumour involving the local lord's suspiciously tan cousin from Normandy. Harrowing techniques varied greatly from one manor to the next, and it could take generations for a particularly clever design, say, a spike angle adjusted just so, to amble its way to the next shire. But even in its slow progression, the harrow did what it was best at, staying humble, staying useful, and not drawing too much attention to itself. A major difference between a peasant and a knight, you see, was not just the armour or the dental plan. It was that one got poems and the other got calluses. Yet without the harrow, all the calluses in the world wouldn't yield a decent harvest. Crops needed well-stirred beds in which to germinate, and this spiky little contraption delivered on that front, literally, one clod at a time. And while the nobility hosted feasts and invented new ways to wear wool flamboyantly, the true drama was unfolding just beyond their tapestry-lined halls. Picture it, a field pressed flat by the methodical dragging of spikes, seeds gingerly sown by hands worn soft by repetition, and birds lurking in the hedgerows like feathery tax collectors. All owed a quiet debt to the humble harrow, field flattener, seed gently nester, dirt-smoothing champion of charm-free utility. Of note, some early scholarly documents describe farmers using thorny branches instead of metal or wood. This was likely out of economic necessity, though it may also have been a way to discourage overly curious sheep from investigating new seedbeds. In any case, it worked about as well as strapping a porcupine to a sled, but with substantially less liability. By the high Middle Ages, iron-toothed harrows became more common thanks to improvements in forging techniques, and because nobody wants to spend their morning reattaching splintered branches to a contraption that looks like a cursed sled. Iron, it turned out, didn't just make fabulous chainmail. it also made stubborn soil more agreeable. And so, the days of the medieval field continued with the harrow faithfully following its best friend, the plough, across countless acres. Quiet, consistent, and never much for drama. No troubadour ever sang of it. No battle was fought for its honour. Yet in many ways, the very bread of life depended on its pointy, scraping devotion. Now, while the harrow worked best, once the soil had been politely upturned, something else was waiting in the proverbial wings. Seed, glorious seed. How to plant it without acting like a careless chicken dropping it at random. That's where we're headed. But for now, rest your eyes like an autumn field and let the soil of your thoughts settle into sleep. In the golden quiet of a medieval spring, somewhere between the plop of a cow in the mud and the distant, stern clang of a monastery bell, there stood a tool so simple, so bafflingly humble, it went largely unnoticed by history. Until now. Enter the harrow. Ah yes, the harrow, a name that rolls off the tongue like a half-forgotten riddle. And truthfully, at first glance, it's easy to mistake a harrow for a short fence that fell over and gave up on life. But in the deeply uneventful world of medieval agriculture, it was the rock star of soil-smoothing technology. After the earth had been whipped into submission by the plough, the land remained a riot of clumps and rude depression. Any seeds dropped upon it would have rolled off like confused marbles in a bowl of lumpy porridge. Enter the harrow, a contraption of wooden or iron teeth, dragged across the freshly ploughed field to break down the clumps and coax the soil into a fine, seed-receiving powder. It didn't hum or move quickly or do anything that might cause excitement in even the drowsiest of monks, but by medieval standards, it was a crowd pleaser. Now, medieval farmers didn't come by harrows easily. They had to craft these tools by hand, often from leftover materials. Iron was precious after all. A blacksmith might sneer at you for wasting good metal on soil toothing, unless you sweetened the deal with sheep cheese or a promise to finally fix his leaking roof. Most harrows in the earlier centuries resembled large wooden racks, their teeth sometimes nothing more than sharpened sticks. If this sounds unimpressive, well, that's because it was. But even unimpressive tools have destinies. Quietly, patiently, the harrow revolutionized the way seeds met the soil. No longer did farmers throw seed onto unruly fields and hope for a wheat miracle from the heavens. With the harrow, that seed could settle into cradles of soft earth, tucked in like weary villagers under woolen blankets. And something astonishing happened in the most gradual and unspectacular way. Yields increased. More food meant more people. More people meant more herbalists, more poets, more knights with questionable haircuts. All thanks, in part, to a dragged grid of wood spiked with teeth. Now, not all harrows were created equal. Over time, clever hands gave birth to several types. There was the rigid-tooth harrow, reliable but painfully inflexible, much like medieval tax collectors. There was the chain harrow, preferred for lighter work and field finishing, and sounding faintly like something invented by a bored jailer during lunch. And eventually, iron-toothed harrows emerged, somehow making the act of soil smoothing slightly more dramatic, at least in terms of weight and hernia risk, if one was lucky enough to own, say, a spiky harrow and a pair of oxen who didn't mind dragging it. The job of smoothing the field could be completed in a few aching hours. But for those less fortunate, it was done by hand. Yes, by hand. With the farmer himself dragging that heavy wooden mass across the field, muttering vague questions about the meaning of life, and if this would perhaps be the year that his oats respected him. Curiously, the harrow never quite enjoyed the same romantic reputation as the plough. It lacked that raw, furrow-cutting chutzpah, yet it persisted. Season after season, field after field, it whispered across the land, scraping medieval ambition into the soil like an underpaid lullaby. Even monks, when not busy illuminating manuscripts or brewing ale thick enough to spread with a knife, respected the power of the harrow. Agricultural tracts of the period mention it, albeit briefly, usually sandwiched between commentary on crop rotations and warnings about turnip blight. Yet there it was, slipping silently into the annals of rural improvement. Underneath those ever-expanding wooden teeth lay one truth, that food comes not from grand flourishes, but from repeated, boring movement, and few tools understood that better than the noble harrow. So if tonight you rest with a full belly and a working knowledge of mid-millennium soil preparation, whisper a quiet thank you to that dragging grid of hope. The harrow never wanted fame, only flat ground and slightly impressed potatoes. And with the fields now smooth and ready, our weary farmer, eyes squinting at the twilight, turns his attention to yet another underrated implement, one small enough to hold in a hand, yet influential enough to change the very nature of planting downstream. Now, let us drift gently to a small corner of northern Europe, where peasants in woolen tunics once debated, in hushed and creaky tones, a topic of supreme importance: whether the moldboard plough was actually that exciting, or only moderately thrilling. You see, before the moldboard came clanking and groaning onto the scene around the 9th century, farmers in many parts of Europe were still toiling with the ard plough. The ard. Such a poetic name for what was essentially a strong stick dragged through dirt, had served its purpose gallantly for centuries. But as fields expanded, soils deepened, and expectations grew as heavy as a sack of turnips, its limitations became tragically apparent. The ard, bless its primitive little blade, scratched the surface of the earth like a squirrel with performance anxiety. Sure, it worked fine in sandy soils or fields that were no more than a rectangle's worth of hopeful barley. But try pulling an ard through the sticky, clay-rich substrata of northern France during a damp spring, and you'd end up with a mud-caked mess and a disappointed ox. Enter the moldboard plough, the medieval equivalent of upgrading from a butter knife to a scalpel. Unlike the ard, which basically sliced and hoped for the best, the moldboard actually turned the soil over, flinging each furrow with a little twist, like a plough doing interpretive dance. This meant better aeration, improved moisture retention, and, rather excitingly, a marked increase in crop yields, although nobody wanted to admit how thrilling they secretly found it. For much of Europe, this was a big deal, dramatically so by medieval standards. Villages whispered about it. Monks wrote treatises on its divine efficiency. And somewhere in a smoky hut, a middle-aged man named Geoffrey probably raised a mug of lukewarm mead and toasted to soil inversion. Of course, as with all innovations, the moldboard came with its own set of complications, mostly in the form of heavier equipment, more robust animals, and an annoying tendency to wobble if not properly hitched. Suddenly, oxen had to be trained more carefully, carts had to be wider, and people had to walk behind a particularly aggressive wedge of wood and iron. Yes, walking behind a plough became as much an exercise in navigation as in stamina. Early ploughmen were like the Formula One drivers of the medieval countryside, but with lower speeds, more mud, and an equal amount of shouting. To operate a moldboard plough was to wrestle physics with each step, trying to guide its curved form through fields that weren't always cooperative. Still, the effort was worth the trouble. Villages expanded their fields, populations grew, and all across Northern Europe, modest but deeply satisfying surpluses began to appear in grain, ale, and the number of arguments about how best to store parsnips over winter. And there was a curious social consequence too. As the moldboard plough became more common, some villages began to organize strip farming. No, not that kind, wherein long, narrow strips of arable land were divided among peasants. It was the most respectable form of land division that also strongly resembled ribbon cake. These strips encouraged cooperative work and communal ploughing days, which in turn led to a wide assortment of passive-aggressive conversations about who left furrows crooked near the boundary again. But it was perhaps the earliest hint of European suburban neighbour disputes, and for that alone, we must tip our nightcaps. It's difficult to overstate how slowly all this unfolded. From the introduction of the moldboard to widespread use took centuries. It creaked its way east and west at the pace of gossip carried by wind and oxen. But slowly, very slowly, the countryside changed. Fields grew more orderly. Harvest became a bit less catastrophic. And the simple act of turning earth became emblematic of a world inching toward greater sophistication, one muddy bootstep at a time. In many ways, the moldboard didn't just turn soil. It quietly turned a new chapter of agrarian life. And in the next meadow over, almost imperceptibly, something else was changing as well. The bits and bobs of the harness. But that, dear listener, is a matter best grazed upon a little later, as the twilight deepens and the fields quiet once again. Let us wander there soon, gently, somewhere across a muddled patchwork of medieval fields, where sheep occasionally daydream and hedgerows act as gossip barriers for the wind. A rather shy revolution was beginning. And no, we're not talking about knights or castles or the kind of swords that shine under moonlight. We're talking about the most unassuming game changer of them all, the moldboard plough. Yes, the moldboard plough. Proof that not all that is noble wears a helmet. This gently curving piece of iron tucked behind a wooden share quietly changed the course of European agriculture without once demanding a title or a ballad. Before this curvaceous contraption came along, early ploughs, scratch ploughs, as they were affectionately and somewhat condescendingly called, did their best to tickle the earth into submission. They merely scratched shallow grooves into the topsoil, hoping crops would find this sufficient. And when they didn't, medieval farmers grumbled, crops sulked, and famine looked over everyone's shoulder like an uninvited dinner guest. But then, the moldboard arrived on the scene, probably without a dramatic entrance or even a trumpet fanfare, and began flipping soil like a professional pancake chef in slow motion. This wasn't just a plough that moved dirt. It lifted it, twisted it, and laid it back down like a freshly made blanket, revealing the nutrient-rich layer underneath. Suddenly, farming in the heavier, soggier clays of Northern Europe became something more than medieval mud wrestling. It's important to note that the moldboard plough didn't just wander into the 10th century on its own. It was part of a team. It needed an effective draft system, usually a patient ox or possibly several, who liked plodding in a straight line and didn't mind a bit of mud between the hooves. Add in a harness that didn't strangle your livestock, a technological marvel in itself, and you had yourself a productivity boost that made monasteries take notice and landlords rub their calloused hands in delight. Indeed, the monasteries were early adopters of the heavy plough. Cistercian monks, who frankly lived to farm and pray in equal measure, paved the way in using this new device to tame the untamed soil. You see, while some people conquer with swords or persuasion, the Cistercians conquered with iron and oxen. A most persuasive duo, really. Grassy wilderness trembled at the sound of the moldboard grating through its underlayers. The impact of all this, a slow-motion boom in food production, a swelling of villages, and the occasional surplus that didn't collapse at the first sign of a late frost. Lords now had tenants who didn't starve by December, and demographers, if they had existed then, would have finally had something to write home about. Of course, no conversation about the moldboard would be complete without a humble nod to ridge and furrow farming, that elegant series of wobbly earth waves still visible from airplane windows today, albeit now mostly admired by curious sheep and conferences of aerial archaeology. Farmers using heavy moldboard ploughs began to follow a logical serpentine pattern across the land, turning fields into corduroy landscapes. The furrows channeled water where it ought to go, ideally anywhere but your root vegetables, and the ridges dried quickly enough to be respectable farmland. All of this soil choreography allowed medieval fields to breathe a little better. And breathe they did, exhaling barley, oats, and a prideful smattering of rye. Wheat, of course, liked to be fussy, but even it came around eventually, once it stopped sulking about the dampness. Oddly poetic, really, how the development of a better plough led to a better loaf of bread. Scratch ploughs made pancakes, the moldboard made sourdough. Or, the medieval equivalent, possibly more brick than buoyant, but no one complained when they were full. So the next time you bite into a crusty end piece or admire a sourdough starter's mysterious bubbles, spare a sleepy thought for some medieval monk or mud-splattered serf guiding a plough through a soggy patch of future prosperity. Behind every good crust, there's a curving piece of metallurgy that dreamed humble dreams of soil turned smooth. And just ahead, as twilight drapes its cool shawl over the village commons, we continue our plod forward, from polished ploughshares to the curious case of medieval meadow management. There comes a moment in every age when someone, perhaps weary of tugging a crooked stick through relentless earth, ask themselves the most world-changing of questions. What if digging didn't have to be this terrible? In medieval Europe, this echo of thought drifted through the cabbage-scented air of peasant fields and landed squarely in the fertile patch of what would become the moldboard plough. Now, before your pulse races, let me assure you, this is not the part where fields erupt in high-stakes action or choreographed oxen battles. No, this is the part where we delve gently, much like that newly invented plough, into the soil of incremental innovation. Because that's how real change happens. Slowly, uneventfully, with a lot of grunting. You see, prior to this development, farmers used what's elegantly known as the ard, also known as the scratch plough. The ard was not so much a plough as it was a polite suggestion to the soil. It poked, it grazed, it made furrows only a mouse might appreciate. For centuries, the ard did its best to disturb the surface of the earth without truly flipping it over, which, as you might imagine, made farming a little like cooking with only half the ingredients, effective enough if you were growing tough little grains like barley, but not ambitious, not turnip-worthy. Enter the moldboard plough, a creation so evolutionary it made the ard look like a bent spoon, with a heavy vertical blade for cutting, a horizontal share for slicing, and most importantly, the curious, curling moldboard itself. This contraption did something miraculous. It didn't just pierce the earth. It neatly turned over the soil like opening the page of the Earth's diary and reading back all the thoughts the topsoil had been keeping to itself. The beauty of the moldboard lies in physics disguised as poetry. As it moved along, the moldboard would lift and roll the soil to one side, artfully burying weeds, aerating subsoil, and showing plant roots they no longer had to struggle so pathetically for breath. It was the agricultural version of changing the sheets on a very dirty bed. But as with most upgrades in history, there was a catch, and the catch was this. Wait, the newfangled plough was hefty, heavy enough to make a single ox snort in disbelief and pretend to be very interested in a patch of grass instead of hauling it. So ploughing teams evolved too. 2 oxen, 4 oxen, sometimes 8 if the soil played particularly hard to plough. Medieval farmers began forming beastly choirs of oxen, synchronized in their trudging, all under the gruff encouragement of one beleaguered farmer with an aching back and possibly a lukewarm flask of onion soup. Then came the secondary innovation. Wheels. Wheels on a plough. Imagine the shock. Nobles fainted. Monasteries gasped. Adding wheels wasn't just clever. It was revolutionary. The instrument could now roll instead of drag. It was like giving sneakers to a tortoise. Still slow, but well equipped. But the wheel plough, too, had its downsides. It wasn't a democratic tool. This was a machine for the spacious, open fields of the north, especially the heavier, clay-rich soils of northern Europe. Those blessed with loamy dirt celebrated with the enthusiasm of a medieval farmer who just found an uncracked turnip in March. Meanwhile, the poor souls scraping sandy earth in the south stuck to the yard, probably while muttering something sarcastic about northerners and their needlessly fancy implements. And yet, the moldboard plough began to shift more than soil. It altered the very structure of medieval society. Suddenly, with better yields, people didn't need quite so many hectares to survive. Villages grew. Food stores didn't always vanish by February. Even the ever-looming spectre of famine kept a slightly more respectable distance. In monasteries, monks began to take note, not just of the scriptures, but of the curious progress unfolding in furrows and fields. They copied plough designs alongside psalms, as though St. Benedict himself recommended optimal blade angles. By the 11th century, the moldboard plough had drifted from novelty to necessity. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't fast, but it quite literally turned the tide of agricultural capability. Soil had been conquered, gently, grudgingly, with clever curves and plodding persistence. And as the twilight fell softly upon the ridged fields, casting sleepy shadows across the turned earth, monks and peasants alike rested with the comforting knowledge that at least some things, namely weeds and medieval hunger, now lay soundly buried. But while the moldboard reigned supreme in the north, another innovation was quietly taking root in the barnyards and fields farther afield. One that would give our friend the plough a rather helpful sidekick, a harness, a team member, 4-legged, and somehow even lower maintenance than an ox. But that's a story for another sleepy moment. By the time the 10th century rolled around, European peasants had come to terms with the fact that, yes, they would be working the fields forever, and no, wheat would not suddenly decide to harvest itself. With this delicate understanding in place, there came a humble but quietly revolutionary twist in the tale of tilling. The great and surprisingly unsensational rise of crop rotation. Ah yes, crop rotation. Just the phrase alone gently lulls excitement into a coma. But in the tapestry of agrarian development, this little twist deserves its due. Not because it was flashy, it wasn't, but because it kept the soil from turning into something as productive as a moody cat. Before this breakthrough, the go-to routine was the two-field system. Peasants would plant crops on one half of the land while letting the other lounge around in a luxurious dirt-based vacation known as fallow. The idea was simple. Don't overwork the soil, much like the local blacksmiths. Apprentice, the earth needed regular breaks to avoid burnout. Not metaphorical burnout, of course, but the very literal exhaustion of nutrients. However, as more mouths appeared across the manorial landscape, and not just the literal mouths of humans, but also the metaphorical mouth of the tithe collector, it became clear that letting half the land take naps all year wasn't the most efficient plan. Something had to change. Enter, stage left, the three-field system, the agrarian equivalent of inventing socks with separate toes. Unnecessary for some, but life-changing for others. Here's how it worked. Land was divided into 3 parts instead of 2. One field would host autumn crops like wheat or rye. The second would support spring crops such as oats or barley. And the third, rather contentedly, would continue to lie fallow, snoozing in the sunlight without a care. The next year, rotate them around. And the next, rotate again. A graceful waltz of soil and seed. The result of this agricultural choreography was nothing short of relatively noticeable. Food production increased slowly but steadily. Villages had a bit more to eat, a little more to trade, and perhaps most critically, slightly fewer dreams of hurling turnips in frustration. It wasn't a revolution per se, more like a polite shuffle forward in the long queue of historical improvement. Now, changing national farming systems wasn't something peasants decided on over a cheeky mead and a slice of barley bread. Much of the guidance came from monastic communities who, when not singing, scribing, or struggling heroically through Latin, also acted as quietly brilliant agricultural theorists. Monks, after all, had both time and land, which made them ideal proponents of better field management and awkwardly fitting robes. These monastic trial-and-error gardens became laboratories of livelihood, cultivating not only strawberries and questionable wine, but new ideas. Written in worn script upon disintegrating parchment were simple diagrams and planting schedules, the medieval equivalent of Pinterest gardening boards, minus the chicken-themed kitchen decor. Still, for all its wisdom and subtle agricultural wizardry, crop rotation did not sweep across the continent like a fevered trend. Peasants were, understandably, a bit hesitant. For one, it required remembering which field had what crop last year, a task complicated by the lack of spreadsheets and the frequent arrival of Vikings. Nevertheless, over generations, the practice crept its way into common use, just like moss sneaks up the side of a stone barn. And thus, the fields grew fuller, the soil stayed livelier, and the peasants, well, they still got sore backs. But at least now, there was slightly more bread to complain over. As dusk settled across the furrowed hillsides of medieval Europe, the three-field system did its quiet work, whispering nutrients back into the ground, with all the understated elegance of humus in bloom. Agricultural advancement, you see, wasn't always about flashy invention. Sometimes it was simply knowing when to let dirt take a nap. And as we rest our eyes tonight, with visions of oats dancing not quite as gracefully as sugar plums, we begin to approach a new frontier, not found in the soil, but just beneath it. A tale of roots, rot, and the unspoken romance between crops and compost. If, one quiet morning in 13th century Flanders, you found yourself among the hedgerows, dew settling like precious silver on leaves, you might have heard a curious sound echoing between the furrows, not the clash of swords or the poetry of troubadours, but the slow, rhythmic creak of a wheelbarrow. Yes, the wheelbarrow, an invention so grandly underwhelming, so delightfully basic, that it sauntered into medieval life with exactly the amount of fanfare it deserved. None. And yet, the humble wheelbarrow changed everything. Before the wheelbarrow, if you wanted to move a heap of soil, a pile of rocks, or a stubborn cluster of root vegetables, you either carried it in your arms like an agricultural martyr, or roped a plucky donkey into service, assuming you had such a creature on hand and it wasn't already occupied with other important tasks, like biting the village priest. Then someone, no one knows who, though one can imagine a man named something like Geoffrey the Tired, looked at a barrel, looked at a wheel, looked at his back riddled with complaints and thought, what if? Moments later, or possibly weeks, depending on how determined and sober Geoffrey was, the wheelbarrow was born. A single wheel up front, wide tray in the middle, 2 handles in the back. So simple, so serenely inelegant. Yet to the weary farmer, it might as well have been a gilded chariot. With this miracle of mediocrity, one person could do the work of 3, or at least 1.5, depending on one's commitment to lunch breaks. You see, medieval farming wasn't in a hurry. The wheelbarrow found its way across Europe by quietly inserting itself anywhere weight needed to be moved, whether on the field, the monastery garden, or the backyard cabbage commune maintained by local nuns, who, historians assure us, had very strong feelings about turnips. But not everyone welcomed this new contraption. There were skeptics, traditionalists with aching joints and stiff pride, who sneered, if God wanted us to use wheels on farms, he wouldn't have made mud. There were even whispers, yes, actual wheelbarrow gossip, that it made people lazy. Of course, these mutterings often came from folks who had 4 or more sons available to carry things while they watched, thumbs looped through belt loops like chore sergeants. Yet the logic of the wheel began rolling forward. Villages, already semi-powered by frustration and barley ale, realized this tool could be tailored. Larger ones for bricks at cathedral sites, smaller ones, light and nimble, perfect for delicate herbs down at the abbey. With each variation, the tool seemed to domesticate itself further, like a shy cat inching toward the hearth. Monks, keen on writing down absolutely everything from bread recipes to compelling arguments about whether snails were fish, occasionally illustrated wheelbarrows in the margins of their manuscripts, perched jauntily next to saints, dragons, or knights mid-ponder. Not exactly reverent, but historically accurate. Even art joined the cart party. In the early 15th century, a few Netherlandish painters began tucking wheelbarrows into pastoral scenes with as much subtlety as a strawberry in a salad. Not obvious, but when you noticed it, there it was, rolling dignity. And there's something deeply human about that, isn't there? Amid the armor, the cathedrals, and the calamities, here was an object made simply to make the day slightly easier. The wheelbarrow didn't vanquish dragons or inspire wars. It didn't advise kings or star in ballads. But it did carry earth, one slow, squeaky trip at a time. And in doing so, it gently tipped the scales of labor. And so, the muddy trails of the lowlands bore the whispery wheel tracks of quiet progress, like the footprints of a very tired idea finally getting somewhere. As dusk slips across the fields and the last load of dung is wheeled home beneath a rose-colored sky, we find ourselves drifting ever so gently toward another of history's underestimated heroes, one not so concerned with wheels, but something sharper, stronger, and forged in fire. As dusk settles over the muddy fields of 12th century Europe, our story ambles onward, this time to a humble development that may not cause your heart to race, but will certainly help you sop up medieval trivia like freshly ploughed soil absorbs spring rain. Tonight, in the whispering quiet of history's slow lane, we turn to the harrow. Yes, that underappreciated cousin of the plough. If the heavy plough was the bold, daring knight of the medieval farming toolkit, braving the hard-pan soils of the north with pointed conviction, then the harrow was the knight's slightly clumsy squire, faithful, essential, but rarely sung about in bardic verse, unless perhaps the bard had trouble sleeping and needed material that truly lulled a crowd. Now, imagine a wooden frame, heavy and a bit ungainly, covered with iron teeth or wooden pegs, dragged across the fields behind a mule with patience problems, or an ox with attention span issues. That's your harrow. No, it didn't cut dashing lines through the soil, or bring feudal lords to tears with its functionality. But it did break up clods of earth, smooth the ground, and lovingly tuck seeds into their new subterranean homes, like a very slow-motion gardener tucking a child into bed. Before the harrow, farmers had to rely on less refined post-ploughing techniques. Some would manually rake the entire field, which sounds charming until you factor in the back, pain, the blisters, and the local rooster who never respected your personal space. Others might simply scatter the seed and hope for cloud cooperation and light hoof traffic. But gradually, as ironwork improved and peasant ingenuity refused to stay idle, or idle in the literal sense, rest was not exactly on the medieval chore chart, the harrow came into wider use. Drawn by beasts of burden, it gently grated the landscape, covering seeds with just enough earth to lend them privacy, yet welcome them warmly into the local soil society. Around this same time, the design evolved, because medieval inventiveness, while slow, was as inevitable as spilled ale at a harvest festival. From simple wooden teeth came replaceable iron tines, because nothing boosted agricultural morale like a removable part. Some harrows were spike-toothed, others were chain harrows, made of metal links that flopped their way across the land like medieval spaghetti. Rollers were added later, creating a kind of agricultural lint roller that flattened the earth and made it easier for seeds to sprout without developing a complex about it. Of course, not everyone welcomed harrowing innovation with open arms. There were traditionalists who believed that breaking up the soil with anything fancier than a stick encouraged laziness, possibly heresy, and definitely more gossip at the communal bread oven. Nonetheless, the harrow persisted. It was slower than a rumour in a monastery, but far more reliable. In regions like England and the Low Countries, harrows found themselves as standard companions in the noble quest for wheat, barley, and the occasional oat field of dreams. And so, it quietly threaded its way into agricultural routine, never flashy, but ever helpful, like the neighbour who always returns your lost chickens. It smoothed out bumps in the field and inadvertently in society. With better seed coverage came better yields, and with better yields came fuller pantries, alongside fewer reasons to storm the Lord's granary with a pitchfork and a prayer. It is tempting to romanticize the pastoral past, to imagine medieval farmers whistling in the cherry-scented breeze, their tools gleaming like holy relics in the sun. But in reality, the harrow was dusty, slightly rickety, and probably covered in dung. But it worked. It worked in the way so many small things do, steadily, quietly, and with just enough squeak to remind everyone it was doing its job. And it was this quiet perseverance that helped usher in a new rhythm of planting and harvesting, of seasons met not with dread, but with modest optimism. The harrow didn't draw fanfare, but it did draw lines of gentle progress through the freshly turned fields. But progress, like a sleepy donkey on a muddy lane, never lingers in one place for long. Just as the harrow settled into its role, storing seeds beneath its wooden grin, something new was stirring on the horizon of the medieval countryside. Something involving larger teams of animals, rotating schedules, and a renewed obsession with crop positioning. So, fluff your pillow like a well-tilled field, and let us drift toward the next gentle innovation on our bedtime journey through the unremarkable, but oddly delightful, world of medieval agricultural tools. By the 12th century, the humble wheelbarrow had begun to creak its way into the European countryside. A single-wheeled chariot of modest ambition, it had no dreams of grandeur, no lust for speed, only a quaint aspiration to make life a touch easier for the peasant who was tired, sore-backed, mud-splattered, and morally betrayed by overly heavy buckets. The wheelbarrow, dear listener, was a revolution in subdued semicircles. Imagine a farmer named Edric, because all proper medieval peasant stories deserve a good Edric, squinting at a pile of dung that had begun to assert itself with aggressive olfactory confidence. Edric had choices. He could haul it one bucketful at a time, as his father had done, and his father's goat had watched with mild disapproval. Or he could use this glorious contraption, a wooden tray atop a single squeaky wheel, and handles worn smooth from gratitude, and move 3 times as much dung in one elegantly wobbly trip. The wheelbarrow's arrival to medieval Europe is a bit of a mystery thick with scholarly shrugging. Some historians suggest it trundled over from China, where iron-framed wheelbarrows were already ferrying goods like victorious ants. Others suggest inspiration lurked closer to home, perhaps from Roman 2-handled handcarts that enjoyed a slow-burning popularity. But however it arrived, by the high Middle Ages, it had been welcomed like a shy yet helpful cousin who turns up just in time to carry water to the pigs. Unlike many inventions of the era, the wheelbarrow did not inspire songs, ballads, or elaborate cathedral carvings. No one built a sculpture to honor it, though frankly, someone should have. Its design was a matter of practical serenity. 1 wheel, sometimes 2, if a local wheelwright was feeling flamboyant. A wooden box bed, and 2 arms projecting like wings to be held by one's very tired, calloused hands. It changed everything and nothing at all. The wheelbarrow didn't end hunger, didn't unseat kings, didn't bring about the Renaissance. But in the muddy fields of Wessex or Aquitaine, it meant that 3 sacks of barley could make the journey from barn to market without summoning a mule or 2 surly cousins. That, in its own quietly triumphant way, was a miracle. Interestingly, the layout of these early European wheelbarrows differed from their Chinese siblings. In China, the wheel was often in the center of the load-bearing area, allowing the contraption to balance the burden and reducing the strain on the person pushing it. But the Europeans, in their endless commitment to spine-centric suffering, insisted on placing the wheel at the front, ensuring that most of the burden remained on the person doing the pushing. It was almost philosophical, a quiet medieval belief that character was best forged through unnecessary upper body strain. Still, despite the aching backs, the wheelbarrow rapidly became a peasant favorite, second only to the nap and possibly hard cheese. It delivered turnips, rocks, bricks, ale barrels, compost, and above all else, time. precious minutes and hours recaptured from the tedious repetition of hauling with one's own limbs, like a particularly determined tortoise. And yet, like many innovations, it didn't spread with alacrity. Medieval life was not known for its breakneck pace when it came to adopting new gadgets. There were no flash mobs of ploughmen dancing with wheelbarrows. It was more of a quiet infiltration, one village at a time, each farmer watching the neighbour's wheelbarrow with what we might call medieval envy, a polite bearded kind of desire. Over time, even the nobility learned of this labour-saving device, and wheelbarrows began appearing in monastic gardens and castle kitchens, though these versions were occasionally inexplicably luxurious, constructed of beechwood, fitted with iron studs, and pushed by someone named Geoffrey, who was forbidden from smiling. But regardless of its station, the wheelbarrow squeezed itself into history like a squirrel into a bread basket, unlikely, humble, but undeniably present. And so, as the century wore on and wheelbarrows clattered dutifully across muddy tracks lined with goose feathers and misplaced optimism, they prepared the fields, quite literally, for the next wave of grain-growing ambition. Speaking of grain, our next sleepy step takes us to a deceptively thrilling innovation, one that murmured its way into agricultural history with the understated drama of whispering wheatheads. As the days grew longer in the sleepy, chestnut-shadowed villages of the 13th century, the European peasantry found themselves grappling with a thrilling new concept: crop rotation. Now, I know what you're thinking. Crop rotation. Hold your excitement. But to the medieval mind, this was a bold step in sustainable agriculture, like upgrading from a wooden spoon to a slightly better wooden spoon. Revolutionary. Picture the scene: a modest field bordered by hedgerows and inquisitive sheep. A wiry farmer named Edric stands with a furrowed brow and an even more furrowed field. Until recently, Edric and his neighbours had been employing the two-field system, in which one field was planted while the other was left fallow, like a sort of agricultural sabbatical. The fallow fields were a place of rest, reflection, and occasional goose loitering. But this method had its limits. The land was tired, the yield was paltry, and the villagers continued to measure their annual wheat haul using units like disappointment and not enough. Then came the triumph of the three-field system. Oh yes, we're talking about more than just a third wheel at the plough party. This change introduced a rotating structure. One field planted in autumn with winter crops like wheat or rye, another planted in spring with peas, lentils or barley, and a third left fallow. Suddenly, diversity wasn't just a trait for village gossip. It was an agricultural strategy. Not that Edric understood the nitrogen-fixing properties of legumes, of course. He just noticed that the strange little green pods he'd yanked from the earth, suspiciously unbread-like, seemed to make next year's bread fields grow better. Whether it was magic, manure, or some mysterious alchemy of both, the three-field system arrived like a soggy miracle. And so, field management became a kind of slow-motion choreography: autumn sowing, spring planting, fallow rest, repeat. Like the seasons themselves doing a gentle waltz, with a cow occasionally cutting in. Villagers whispered of increased yields, a modest surplus, more porridge on the table, even enough grain to trade for fancy notions, like cloth, salt, or that mysterious soap the monks kept mumbling about. Of course, as with all great changes in history, there was resistance. Old Wulfric, a thatch-kneed farmer with a cat named King Henry, the cat had no relation to the monarchy, insisted it was unnecessary. 3 fields is extravagant nonsense, he grumbled, adjusting his tattered cap. "In my day we made do with dirt and disappointment." But even Wulfric had to admit, begrudgingly, that the new method left him with a little extra time. Extra time that he used, perhaps unwisely, to take up whittling miniature oxen out of turnips. A budding artist or a vegetable vandal? History remains silent on the matter. Meanwhile, across the manors and hamlets, manorial lords patted themselves on their velveted backs for allowing these agricultural adjustments, convinced they had single-handedly solved the food shortage by permitting tediously logical farming methods. "Let it be known," declared one particularly ornate baron, adjusting his codpiece while astride a suspiciously fashionable goat, "that under my watchful eye the larder grows fat, probably because of my cleverness and completely unrelated to peasant labour." His goat, unimpressed, made a dismissive chewing motion. The church even got involved. Monks, who had been meticulously copying ancient texts and avoiding small talk for centuries, began noting the benefits of crop rotation in their marginalia. Amid illuminated saints and fire-breathing tortoises, artistic license was alive and well. One might spot a modest diagram of a rotating field cycle, delicately inked in between musical notes and stern Latin warnings about the sin of idleness. This sudden increase in productivity didn't launch a grand economic boom. It didn't end war, plague, or Wulfric's mumbling. But it did ensure a little more food on the table, and a little less starvation in the streets. And in medieval terms, that's as close to a standing ovation as a plough could ask for. So as stars began twinkling above muddy cottages, and oxen rested their weary haunches, farmers gazed out over their rotated fields, not with excitement, but with the contented fatigue of knowing they'd spent the day doing the slow, dull work that feeds kingdoms, monasteries, and cats named after royalty. And somewhere on the horizon, another innovation stirred, quietly, patiently, almost suspiciously, something to do with weeds and wool. But that, dear dreamer, may be a tale for another twilight. At a glance, the medieval harrow doesn't strike one as history's most riveting achievement. It certainly didn't glitter like a suit of armour or sing songs like a lute. It was a humble, draggy contraption. A row of wooden teeth meant to break up the soil after ploughing, disturb weeds, and create the rustic version of a seedbed. A sort of agricultural toothbrush for the earth, with none of the glamour and all of the scraping. But in the quiet moments of medieval life, when the dew clung stubbornly to the barley and the sun yawned up over the crest of the thatched roof village, the harrow was key. Without this cranky claw on wheels, or, more often, on ropes pulled behind groaning beasts, medieval farmers would have had a much tougher time convincing the soil to cooperate politely with planted seeds. You see, once the soil had been ploughed, often with a heavy, sulky-looking mould-board plough that tore into the earth like it had a grudge, the result was a patchwork of clods and furrows, rougher than a knight's first poetry attempt. That planting surface simply wouldn't do for the delicate task of broadcasting seeds. Enter the harrow. It smoothed, it shattered clumps, and it acted like the final pass of the medieval hairstylist's comb before the big harvest dance. The earliest harrows were little more than branches lashed together, the kind of thing you might assemble if you were a bored shepherd with twine and ample saplings. These drag harrows, they were called, though rarely by the farmers themselves, who preferred more colourful nicknames like the Clump Killer or the Splinter Devil. Eventually, some bright spark realised that adding pointed wooden spikes or the occasional discarded piece of iron scrap might increase the harrow's enthusiasm for soil rearrangement. This dramatically improved the effectiveness of the tool, though it also improved the likelihood of stubbed toes, pierced shoes, and the alarming shriek of old Oswin when he tripped over one near dusk. In many villages, the harrow became a communal tool. Why build one per household when one weary harrow could be shared, and argued over, and misplaced, and suspiciously found outside the miller's barn again, despite strict scheduling policies? And so, villages developed harrow calendars, sometimes carved into wood, to publicly display precisely whose turn it was to have the honor of dragging the cumbersome beast through the field. There was, of course, a hierarchy of harrows. The wealthier estate owners had iron-toothed harrows, glinting in the sun like finely combed metal hedgehogs, while the peasants made do with wood, stone weights, and hope. But no matter the material, the job remained the same: churning the topsoil into a fuzzy bed, preparing it for the just right kiss of barley, rye, or if luck allowed, peas. Now, you may be wondering, was there ever a harrowing innovation that changed everything? Did someone ever stand up dramatically in a dusty field and declare, "Friends, I've added wheels"? Well, sort of. Wheeled harrows did appear in later centuries, much to the delight of fields and the dismay of castle blacksmiths, asked to affix handles to yet another spiky contraption, with all the forgiveness of a hedgehog glued to a sled. But in the mellow haze of the 12th and 13th centuries, most harrows were still faithful to their simpler forms: flat wooden frames pulled patiently across damp earth by oxen, horses, or in chariotails, stolen by very determined goats during harvest festivals. Never trust a goat with ambition, they said. Even poets grew fond of the harrow in a roundabout way. In rare but inexplicable instances, harvest songs made lyrical mention of the teeth that coax the sleeping grain, which expertly masked the reality that the main singer was likely just trying to romanticize a profoundly back-aching task. And yet, it worked. The harrow didn't show off. It left no fanfare in its wake, but it allowed seeds to nestle in the soil ever so gently, encouraged rain to settle in the tender crevices it created, and made sure that the next cycle of crops had a fighting chance, even if embraced with nothing more than a grunt and a prayer to Saint Isidore, patron saint of farmers and particularly blessed listeners of muttered cursing. As twilight stretches its lavender fingers across the moors and beasts curl into the warmth of stylized hay piles, the harrow is leaned quietly against the fence post, chipped, cracked, perfectly content with another day's invisible triumph. Rest easy, dear listener. The ground is ready, and tomorrow, something truly thrilling waits. The medieval seed drill. Oh yes, we're really getting into it now. The year is somewhere in the 13th century, and while troubadours strummed their lutes and monks meticulously illuminated the letter Q in oversized manuscripts, something quietly revolutionary was ripping up the soil, literally. You see, among the cabbages, curses, and clanging anvils of medieval life, the arrival of the heavy plough was quietly stealing the spotlight in fields across northern Europe. At first glance, the heavy plough doesn't look particularly seductive. It doesn't sparkle. It sings no songs. And its curves are more iron and oak than anything poetic. But oh, how this lumbering metal-nosed behemoth changed the game. Before its debut, much of the continent's fertile land was, pardon the pun, sitting idle. Northern Europe's dense, clay-laden earth was not seduced by the feeble scratchings of the light scratch plough used in sandy southern soils. The light plough was charming enough for the Mediterranean's soft terrain, but it was embarrassingly unfit for the cold, stubborn soils of Germania and beyond. Imagine trying to rake through wet cement with a soup ladle. That was the vibe. But then, in shuffled the heavy plow. No fanfare, no parade. Just a new technology yanked into existence by necessity and oxen, particularly teams of 8, if you wanted your furrows in a straight line, rather than an abstract expressionist masterpiece. This plow came equipped with a coulter to slice the soil vertically, a ploughshare to peel it horizontally, and best of all, a moldboard that elegantly flipped the soil, exposing its nutrient-rich nether regions to the sun. It was the vegetal equivalent of airing dirty laundry, and the plants loved it. The implications were, well, absolutely thrilling, if you're into things like surpluses and crop rotation. Suddenly, vast tracts of fertile land in the north, once the exclusive domain of moss and melancholic sheep, could now be cultivated with much greater efficiency. More arable land meant more grain. More grain meant more bread. And more bread, that meant fewer peasant uprisings and slightly rounder monks. Now, let's pause and consider the sheer drama of it. A device of iron and determination, pulled by a posse of grunting beasts, carving destiny into the earth itself. Farmers who had once wrestled the land with rudimentary tools could now stroll alongside their oxen, daydreaming about the finer things, like not starving and occasionally owning shoes. This was not just a win for agriculture. It was a quiet revolution in boots caked with seasonal mud. Villages grew, populations increased. The terrifying spectre of hunger, though far from banished, took at least a brief lunch break. The presence of the heavy plough also nudged the social order. Land that was once seen as marginal became valuable. Settlement patterns shifted. Lords who previously yawned over their forested northern territories now had something to squint at and tax. The humble plough, with its ponderous parts and stoic demeanor, had begun reshaping not just landscapes, but the very structure of medieval society. It even sneaked into language and law. In parts of Europe, land was measured not just in acres, but by the number of oxen required to plough it. Talk about ox-based taxation, an utterly bureaucratic delight. Yet, for all these changes, the plough itself remained cheerfully unimpressive to look at. No knight would choose it for a joust. No minstrel felt compelled to write sonnets in its honour. But in quiet corners of monasteries and at the edge of barley fields, those who understood knew this lumbering iron slice of practical genius had ushered in a new era of muddy prosperity. So tonight, as you drift quietly into sleep, smile with gentle appreciation for the heavy plough, that working-class hero of medieval progress. While kings plotted campaigns and castles sprouted like fantastical fungi, this unassuming tool got on with the business of changing everything, one stubborn furrow at a time. And just over the next horizon, beyond the rhythm of hooves and creaking yokes, another agricultural curiosity awaits, one where seeds found their guiding hand. Or rather, an early machine with impressively regulated holes. As a soft drizzle of twilight settles over our imaginary medieval village, let us turn our attention to the thrilling. Yes, thrilling in the way lukewarm porridge is thrilling, topic of threshing. Ah, threshing. The subtle art of separating the precious grain from its clingy, inedible ex-boyfriend. The chaff. This wasn't just a tedious farm chore. It was the tedious farm chore. Before the age of machines and the beep-boop efficiency of the combine harvester, threshing was done by hand. Every autumn, peasants would gather in barns, raise their flails, and begin an elegant slow-motion dance of agricultural monotony. Now, You may be asking yourself, what in the name of hay bales is a flail? A fair question, wise listener. Imagine two wooden sticks, one long and one short, connected by a strip of leather or chain. The longer stick is for holding, the shorter, the business end. It's the nunchuck of the Middle Ages, but instead of defending a castle, it was used to assault innocent piles of wheat. The peasant would grip the long staff, swing the flail over their shoulder, and bring it down upon a sheaf of grain with all the enthusiasm of someone who knew they'd have to do this another 500 times before lunch. It was rhythmless music, a duet between man and cereal, echoing through the barn. Threshing wasn't just physically draining. All that swinging left the arms of our forebears as toned as medieval protein shakes would allow. It was deeply communal. Neighbours would thresh together, taking polite turns or, if bold and synchronized, creating a kind of harmonic flailing ensemble. There may even have been singing, not spirited, jovial caroling, but weary chants designed less for morale and more to keep people awake. The invention of the threshing tool might not seem like much to write home about, unless your family was particularly passionate about grain separation, but it was a minor miracle in the slow crawl of agricultural progress. Before tools like the flail, they would stomp on grain, bash it with sticks, or let animals trample it. Imagine an ox walking in circles all day, mashing wheat beneath its hooves, while wondering why no one had yet discovered chess. Eventually, clever minds imagined improvements, simple ones at first. Some tied bundles tighter, others built wooden platforms, ways of reducing mess and letting the breeze carry away the useless bits. This led to the birth of winnowing, the art of tossing grain into the air so the wind could help sort the wheat from the chaff. Nature's collaboration with medieval ingenuity, like a very slow, very earthy smoothie blender. Yet humans, being humans, soon found flailing to be, well, too flailing, inefficient, messy, dangerously easy to bonk a fellow thresher on the ear. So began the dream of mechanization, first in mines, then in wood shops. Enter the threshing board, literally a board with embedded stones or metal bits. Picture someone dragging a cheese grater across straw while standing on it. The ancient Spanish even created versions where oxen pulled the board in circles with a human rider lounging atop. A threshing Uber, if you will. But it wouldn't be until centuries later, in the post-medieval dawn, that real mechanical threshers would scream into being with steam and gears. For now, our modest medieval farmers had their flails, their wind, and their unyielding patience. Threshing time was often aligned with feast days, not out of celebration, but because everyone was already too tired to move. And so, they leaned on one another, both physically and emotionally, beneath the golden eaves of straw-stuffed barns. Fermata moments of slow labor stuck gently in the diary of the seasons. Some monasteries even developed their own variations of the flail, because nothing says divine dedication like innovating how to beat grain more efficiently. The monks probably prayed for good harvests, or at least fewer blisters. And so our humble flail continued its humble service through humble lands. Perhaps one lay forgotten in the corner of a barn even now, collecting dust beside a bucket and a rooster that didn't know it was Tuesday. But there is more, dear listener, for as the fields grew weary from harvest and the tools grew dull from use, something curious was sprouting elsewhere, in the minds of inventors and the forges of blacksmiths. Soon we'll walk alongside these gentle dreamers, those who began to shape metal not just into swords, but into sickles sharper, leaner, and lazier inclined. Out in the mist-kissed fields of medieval Europe, where peasants woke up not to a smartphone alarm, but to the sound of an udder being aggressively milked next door. A certain class of agricultural tools had quietly made their debut. The humble assortment of winnowing contraptions. Not flashy, not loud, certainly not armored. But oh, there they were, sifting grain like it was their solemn calling from the heavens above. In a time long before Dyson or even the broom closet was invented, winnowing was the graceful, slightly inefficient dance of separating grain from chaff. What is chaff, you may ask? Well, think of it as the flaky dandruff of wheat. Looks like food, behaves like static cling, contributes nothing whatsoever to your noble porridge. At first, winnowing wasn't really about tools at all. Instead, it involved tossing grain into the air and letting the wind swoop in like an unpaid intern to carry away the useless bits. If there was no wind, well, then you simply sighed into your cupped hands and hoped for the best. But as the centuries meandered on, and villagers grew less interested in improvising with breezes, they began to improve their options. Enter the winnowing basket. Large, shallow, and slightly warped, not unlike a farmer's opinion of taxes. These baskets were often woven from reeds or thin wood, the sort of construction that said, "This will last until it doesn't." The threshed grain would be placed in the basket, and the peasant would toss and catch, like a medieval juggling act with significantly less applause. Winnowing baskets became such a staple that they featured in artworks, occasionally snuck onto the corner of illuminated manuscripts surrounded by saints, harvest angels, and that one duck who always seemed too close to the table. These baskets weren't just tools. They were quiet symbols of agricultural patience, of low-stakes suspense, if you will. Every toss brought both the potential for a clean yield and the risk of feeding the birds who'd gathered with suspicious enthusiasm. But some clever minds, fueled by a combination of ale and familial pressure to stop wasting Sundays, thought, what if we engineered more control into the art of the sift? Thus, the wind fan winnower crept into existence. Imagine a hand-cranked box with a series of sieves designed to create artificial airflow. It was like inviting your very own wind inside a wooden cabinet. Peasants cranked its handle, feeling both powerful and very tired, while grain shuffled across perforated surfaces. Light chaff would be whisked away by the internal breeze, and the valuable kernels would sink through to waiting containers below. It was all very clever and very splendid, and extremely inefficient if you had weak arms or vaguely rounded corners on your grain. This was one of the first times humans attempted to replicate nature in a box, which, as any medieval alchemist will tell you, usually ended in mild fire. But when the fire stayed away, the results could be rather satisfactory. Despite their mild successes, winnowing tools never really got the attention ploughs or pitchforks received. They stayed low in the social tool hierarchy, beloved by millers perhaps, but snubbed by travelling poets. And yet, without them, much of the grain would have gone unpolished, and entire winter stews would have ended up suspiciously feathery. It's important to understand that medieval peasants weren't just workers. They were field philosophers in mud-caked boots. They knew that between the sowing and the eating lay a season of dust and mild repetitive strain injury. Yet they endured, refining their winnowing techniques year by dreadfully similar year. Curiously, communities would often share and rotate their tools, including the more advanced winnowers. A shared machine might move house to house, followed by an entourage of children and one old goat determined to nap inappropriately. It was the Middle Ages version of a tool library, utterly dependent on honest neighbours and the hope that your cousin didn't lose the crank handle again. And so, as the sun set over another golden field of stubbled wheat and distant livestock indecision, the wind slowed, and the final kernels sifted to the bottom of the basket. Somewhere in the distance, a farmer exhaled with satisfaction, his grain now clean, his hands full of calluses, his dreams that night filled with clouds made of chaff. Tomorrow, we turn our gaze to the tools that fermented not just crops, but the human desire for something stronger than water and less morally ambiguous than mead, in the hushed lull of medieval evenings, when geese stopped honking and even the wind seemed to take a nap. The humble hayfork found its moment in the moonlight, not to be confused with the pitchfork, its rowdier cousin used by cinema peasants to storm the occasional castle. No, the hayfork was gentler, calmer, a kind of quiet diplomat of the feudal fields. You see, in the symphony of agricultural tools, the hayfork was more second violin than lead trumpet. It didn't plough, it didn't thresh, it didn't show off. It merely lifted and fluffed, nudging hay into neat little bundles, fluffier than a lord's bedsheets, and infinitely more useful. Imagine it, sunlight filtering through slow-moving clouds, peasants in thick wool tunics, wielding hayforks like rustic ballet dancers. Their movements were repetitive, yes, but almost meditative. A scoop here, a toss there, soft piles of golden grass slowly taking shape like sleepy, straw-fed clouds on earth. The hayfork itself had a rather elegant anatomy, usually made of strong wood, ash or yew if you were lucky, or had connections with a cooperative forest. It featured 2 or 3 long tines, like fingers that had been doing yoga for centuries. Metal versions would come later, of course, but the wooden fork was beloved, lightweight, durable, and unlikely to impale your foot in a moment of distraction. As safety features go, that was top tier for the 13th century. But its elegance hid a noble secret. This fork didn't exist merely to move hay. It was the silent servant to an entire system of winter survival. Hay, after all, was life. It cushioned animals, fed them during snowbound months, and, in a pinch, plugged a drafty window or two. Without it, cows would moo mournfully and possibly judgmentally all winter long. The fork, then, was midwife to the barn's heartbeat. Each toss of fluff was another beat in the long rhythm of rural endurance. Of course, not just anyone could use one gracefully. A proper hay forking technique required a certain martial poise, a light knee bend, a timing of the wrist, and an ability not to sneeze dramatically into the wind. Apprentices were known to misfire their forks, leading to accidental haystorms or disgruntled sheep, temporarily buried in fragrant foliage. Monasteries, ever the enthusiasts of specialization, occasionally wrote notes about proper hay-stacking technique. Brother Wilfrid, of Lower Darnthistle, for instance, advised that hay should always be stacked with the gentle rise of an angel's breath and the firmness of a bishop's handshake. This advice was exactly as helpful as you'd expect. It's interesting, in a sleepy sort of way, that the hayfork's very simplicity led to its longevity. While other tools went through dramatic reinventions, new angles, rotating parts, terrifying blades, the hayfork just stayed the same, quietly perfect, like a spoon or a lullaby. By the time metal began creeping into its design, many peasants treated the wooden variety like a cherished friend. There were tales, possibly exaggerated, of farmers naming their favorite forks. Thistleprong, Old Pivy, and the Hay Enchanter are among the more poetic names found scratched into stable beams. Forks weren't just tools, they were part of the family, albeit the quiet uncle who only visited during harvest, Ah, and speaking of visits, there's one more place the hayfork found itself beyond the field. Drama. Yes, occasionally, the hayfork made an appearance in rural disputes, usually waggled accusingly at a neighbour for suspected cow poaching or property line misunderstandings. Its presence didn't quite escalate things, but it certainly helped folks take each other more seriously. Nothing says, "we need to talk," quite like gesturing with a three-pronged farming implement. But let's not end on feuds. Instead, drift back to that golden field at twilight, where the scent of hay hangs herbal and sweet in the air, and the only sound is the gentle skip and fall of gathered straw. The hayfork, steady in hand, arcs gracefully through sky and stubble. Again and again, like a lullaby played on a wooden harp. And while our hayfork rests for the night against the barn wall, there's another quiet hero waiting in the wings, a device simple in design and utterly critical to one of medieval life's biggest dilemmas: soggy shoes. We'll tiptoe toward that next. If the medieval world had a true celebrity, an icon whose name whispered through valley and villager alike, it was not a knight nor a queen, but something far more utilitarian. Enter the harrow. Yes, the harrow, the Justin Bieber of secondary tillage. For those new to the slow, winding tapestry of agricultural progression, allow us to review gently, without jolts or exclamations. The plough, as we've explored, broke up the soil with all the subtlety of a drunken bear in a vegetable patch. The harrow, on the other hand, came afterward, delicate, refined, like the gloved hand after the iron fist. It smoothed things over, literally. Picture a field freshly ploughed, all crags and furrows, with tufts of earth jutting out like the hair of a scholar who's just discovered Aristotle was wrong. Enter the harrow, a frame often wooden but increasingly iron by the later medieval centuries, dragging behind oxen or horses, with spikes or teeth or disc-shaped blades, designed to persuade the soil back into a somewhat even state. Is the farm tool equivalent of a warm blanket and a gentle pat on the back. Functionally, the harrow broke up clods, covered sown seeds, and left the field as level as a monk's hairline after morning prayer. But the innovation wasn't just in the doing, it was in how it was done. Earlier harrows, if glamour can be found in such things, were of the drag variety. Imagine a flat frame with wooden teeth dragging across the land, like a toothy sled. Effective, yes, but prone to snapping teeth on larger clumps or unearthly roots. Over time, craftsmen began crafting harrows with replaceable iron tines, because nothing says progress quite like the ability to swap parts. Medieval innovation, dear listener, often looked less like grand revelation and more like a blacksmith quietly saying, "What if this bit came off?" The emergence of the rotary harrow was a later marvel. These had teeth that spun, slowly of course, nothing too exciting, adding a bit of rolling flair to the otherwise predictable back and forth of agrarian monotony. There's little evidence they ever spun fast enough to be thrilling, but perhaps thrilling was never the point. The medieval farmer did not lie awake at night craving velocity. They longed, simply, for less lumpy soil. Of course, harrowing was not just about the tool. It was about timing. Harrow too soon, and the seeds shifted like guests awkwardly seated at a feast. Harrow too late, and weeds would throw their own uninvited banquet. Precision mattered. And yet, despite all this fuss, the act itself remained serenely dull. Even the church, which had opinions on everything from shoe fastenings to celestial alignment, spared few words for harrowing. Perhaps it was seen as God's way of rewarding the quiet faithful with a task requiring neither zeal nor flair. In small villages, the harrow might be shared, passed around like a favourite bonnet or mediocre ale recipe, maintained with the same whispered reverence as one bestows upon an elderly cat. Some wealthier households had their own, adorned with initials carved lovingly into the frame, a sort of rustic monogramming born from long winters and surplus wine. The harrow was dependable. It did not dazzle, but neither did it suddenly catch fire, unlike some of its more combustible mechanical cousins from future centuries. It said, "Hello, I am here to scratch the earth gently until it is ready." That was all, and that was enough. In rare moments, poets of the field, usually those with a chronic shortage of company and an unnatural love of dirt, would sing quietly of the harrow's art, a rhythmic back and forth, grooves made not with passion but purpose, no ballads, no sculpted statues, just a line in a farmer's almanac noting, "Harrowed today, good dirt smell." And really, who needs more than that? By the waning years of medieval timekeeping, as clocks became slightly more polite and less like tortured brass monsters, the humble harrow found itself the bedrock of solid, if entirely uneventful, land preparation. Horses began to replace plodding oxen, which made harrowing slightly faster, though still unlikely to cause dizziness. But with every smoothing sweep of the harrow's iron teeth, the stage was being gently set. A field once furrowed and chaotic now lay calm and level in the golden dusk, ready, waiting. And so we snuggle in, soil soft beneath memory's feet, as our tale turns quietly toward another subtle but critical turning point, when grain met grindstone in the sleepy, flour-dusted world of medieval milling. When we left off, things were already getting wild in the fields of medieval Europe. And by wild, of course, we mean marginally more efficient in the realm of turnip harvesting. Tonight, our candle-lit page-turner continues with an object utterly devoid of pizzazz, yet surprisingly central to rural life between the years 1100 and, oh dear, it's raining again. Let's talk about the flail. No, not the medieval weapon full of chains and morning stars tossed around in knightly tournaments. Though fun at parties, that's not what we're flailing about tonight. The agricultural flail, humble, wooden, and unapologetically boring, was a two-piece tool used to thresh grain. In other words, separating the actual edible part of the wheat from all the nonsense that insisted on growing around it. The flail consisted of a long handle, the staff, and a shorter, swivelling stick, the swipel, attached at the top by a leather thong, cord, or, if you were especially avant-garde, a bit of woven sheep gut. This contraption allowed medieval farmers to rhythmically smack piles of harvested wheat on the barn floor, over and over and over, turning chore into cardio and the barn into a thump-thump symphony of grit, grain, and low-level dissatisfaction. Now, flailing wasn't just some medieval method of taking your frustrations out on agriculture. It was an essential step in the post-harvest process, carried out across barnyards and monastery courtyards with the slow thud of inevitability. Everyone had an uncle who took it a little too seriously. You know, the one who insisted there was an art to the arc and speed of the swing. 2 wheat heads to the left, 1 dramatic flourish to the right, like a very beige ballet. It sounds monotonous because, well, it was. Yet there was something meditative about it. Old Gerald, the village's resident thresher, was known to fall asleep mid-flail, only to wake up hours later still swinging, having entered a trance-like state known unofficially as the farmer's fugue. Though it may have seemed immortal, The flail's popularity started to decay around the 12th to 13th centuries, thanks to improved mechanical solutions. But let's not praise technology too quickly. The flail stuck around, politely refusing to be rendered irrelevant until well into the 19th century in many places. That's the sort of overstayed welcome you don't see much anymore, except perhaps in holiday dinners or extended family reunions. Monasteries, with their suspiciously efficient monks and excellent bookkeeping habits, kept precise records of flailing. There are mentions of competitions on feast days where novices would go head-to-head in timber-smacking duels of dexterity and endurance. The winner presumably received a boiled egg and a mild sense of pride. Interestingly, flailing could only be done under proper conditions, not too humid, or the grain would stubbornly cling to its husks like a toddler gripping onto bedtime. Not too dry, or the chaff would fly into everyone's eyes, noses, and immortal souls. Hence, many threshers' barns had big double doors at each end to allow just the right breeze to dance through, a sort of natural cross-ventilation that doubled as gossip central for village life. Ah, Mary's cow fell in the well again. Is that so? Pass me the swipel then. Flailing also required coordination. In the larger barns, where multiple workers swing their flails in harmony, it was critical to maintain a rhythm. If even one person got offbeat, you'd end up with black eyes, bruised egos, and the kind of slapstick scenario that might have entertained a peasant version of Monty Python. There are even records of secret threshers' songs, used to keep tempo and stave off the creeping realization that one had been hitting straw for 3 consecutive hours. Picture it, Gregorian chants, but make it agricultural. For all its simplicity, the flail had a symbolic life too. In some regions, it became a badge of peasant resistance during uprisings. After all, when your grain separator doubles as a weapon and you have 6 hours of practice every day, small rebellions can get efficiency upgrades. But, like so many stars of the medieval field, the flail eventually yielded to mechanized labor and the quiet advance of the threshing machine, a shift from human rhythm to clanking steam, and with it, another chapter turned in the sleepy saga of agricultural evolution. And as the sun sets over the sifting barn, with dust motes floating like tiny ghosts in the last golden rays, we sway toward the next quiet revolution, a simple shift of shape that made a muddy job a little less miserable, and involved, of all things, the humble wheelbarrow. As the night slips deeper into its velvet hush, we turn now to that most noble of unsung medieval heroes, the wheelbarrow. Yes, the humble, one-wheeled chariot of dirt. While emperors conquered and lords plotted, a solitary laborer somewhere in 12th century China thought, what if I don't carry all of this manure on my back? In fairness, bragging about inventing a wheelbarrow won't win you a statue, mostly because statues are heavy and would require several wheelbarrows. But its quiet arrival revolutionized medieval workloads more than any sword or treaty. A proper wheelbarrow could halve the number of trips a peasant would make from the compost heap to the cabbage patch, which in medieval terms doubled one's free time. And what might one do with that newfound leisure? Perhaps compose a lute song about slightly less back pain. The Chinese, innovative as ever, and likely more tired of hauling things than most, developed early versions as far back as the 2nd century. These were elaborate contraptions, often with the wheel directly under the central payload for balance. Ingenious. Some even had sails. Yes, sails. Like a tiny dirt yacht you could push. Europe, naturally, took a few centuries to catch on. We were still trying to figure out how to convince oxen that straight lines were preferable. And so it wasn't until around the 12th century that European peasants began pushing primitive wheelbarrows through furrowed fields. These simple wooden beasts had a single front wheel and two handles at the back, essentially, if you squint, a really determined seesaw. And yet, within this seemingly simple tool lies a parable of profound historical significance. The wheelbarrow represents a shift toward individualized labor. It allowed one person to move what previously took two or three. As such, it quietly democratized certain aspects of field work, not in a burn down the hierarchy sort of way, but more like a, well, look at Jeff, moving all those turnips on his own now kind of way. Of course, medieval wheelbarrows were not mass-produced. Each one was hand-built by a local carpenter, often slightly lopsided, and squeaky enough to wake the crows. And because roads were more aspiration than infrastructure at the time, wheelbarrowing anything was an experience in uneven jostling. It was the medieval full-body workout, arms tensed, spine flexing, knees alert, and one ear always listening out for the telltale creak that meant another spoke had given up on life. And yet, farmers adored them. Prior to the wheelbarrow, carrying even moderate weight meant balancing it in panniers on the back of a mule. Problematic if mules were scarce or deeply unimpressed with your sense of urgency. With the wheelbarrow, you had some independence. Sure, your arms ached and your path wobbled like a drunken goose, but you no longer needed to schedule your day around whether Bernard the mule was feeling cooperative. Over time, the design refined itself, albeit very gently. Handles got sturdier, the single wheel became stronger, and by the late Middle Ages, wheelbarrows were standard fixtures on farms, monastery grounds, and construction sites for all those delightful stone cathedrals people kept insisting on building tall enough to reach God, or at least to exceed the neighbor town's church. And the presence of the wheelbarrow even entered the symbolism of moral virtue, oddly enough. In certain religious texts, the act of laboring with care and patience, represented by bearing weight, was compared to the spiritual journey. Though I imagine not many monks cheerfully thanked the Lord while wheeling wet gravel uphill during Lent. But perhaps the most romantic slice of wheelbarrow history is that it allowed for an entirely new form of small talk. Two peasants, each leaning on their humble barrow, could exchange memories of last year's barley haul or complain in harmony about excessively muddy paths before returning to their seemingly endless rows. So next time you see a wheelbarrow, give it a nod. It's not just a tool, it's a wooden love letter to that ancient dream of not carrying things the hard way. And as the stars peer gently through the hay-scented mist of time, we wander ever closer to the final whispers of our quaint little saga. One more cobblestone step, and we'll arrive at the satisfying end of our sleepy journey. And so, as the winds of time wafted gently across the quiet fields of medieval Europe, the final stirrings of technological tedium brought us not a great revolution, but something better. A slightly improved hoe. Yes, dear listener, the hoe. A humble tool, often overlooked in tales of knightly valor or dramatic castle sieges, and yet without it, crops would not have grown, bread would not have been baked, and someone somewhere wouldn't have gotten mildly grumpy from hunger. Imagine surviving the Black Death only to be done in by a neglected turnip bed. By the end of the Middle Ages, the hoe, along with her old cousins, the sickle and the pitchfork, had achieved a kind of rustic nobility. Not flashy, but steadfast. Much like that one uncle at family gatherings who always brings plain bread rolls and leaves before dessert. Reliable, unassuming, and strangely vital. Agricultural advancements had become whispers rather than shouts. crop rotation had settled in like an old cat curling into a basket, with a 3-field system, fall, spring and winter, extending its roots deep into the soil of European thinking. Tools, too, had reached a satisfying plateau. Iron-tipped ploughs moved stolidly across the landscape like metal-snouted snails. Flails swung with gentle rhythm in barns that smelled of hay and long-ago stories. And scythes, with blades curved like the moon's grin, sang songless songs as they swept through wheat. Blacksmiths, now seasoned from generations of hammering iron into slightly better shapes, had become low-key community celebrities. Children might not have wanted their autograph, but they definitely knew to stay out of their way unless they wanted a long explanation about grain strain and wooden half-maintenance. Cooperatives, villagers working together, had blossomed into quiet communal rituals. Sharing, wheelbarrows, borrowing yokes, gossiping extensively about whose ox was limping and why. Oxen were never the life of the party, but they could plough a row straighter than any knight's lance charge. And while noble courts debated taxation schemes over stale bread, peasants pursed their lips thoughtfully at their modest but mighty implements. Tools weren't just things they held, they were extensions of their lived reality. A man's spade might be nicked at the handle, known to squeak in springtime, but it glittered with honest use. A woman's rake, once her grandmother's, bore the smooth fingerprints of ancestry. Of course, heraldry never bothered to commemorate the pitchfork, and no minstrel strummed a lute in celebration of the hand thresher. But those tools had their victory songs, murmured in early morning light as frost lifted off a cabbage leaf. Their battles were against the soil, the weather, and the meandering laziness of early summer. And often they won. Meanwhile, monastic scribes were still copying manuscripts, some of which detailed helpful farming techniques, and others that were mostly Latin complaints about breezes and onions. These texts helped preserve agricultural knowledge, but also served as excellent nap inducers should someone get tired whilst alphabetizing different types of cheese mold. Farmers, leaning on their shovels at the end of the day, did not think themselves innovators, but they were, quietly, a new way of binding a scythe, a clever tweak to a tanning rack. The angle of a blade adjusted so it turned soil with less grunt required. It was the kind of innovation that wouldn't make headlines if headlines had existed, but it made dinner possible. And thus, as the late medieval sun hung low and drowsy among the amber haze of a harvested field, the parade of tools gradually stepped into the background, forever part of human rhythm. With each creak of a wheelbarrow or sigh of a millstone, the melody of medieval agriculture faded sweetly into evening. There would be new ages ahead, full of fancier inventions and noisier change. But this chapter, of ploughshares and pitchforks, of rust and routine, was one of quiet triumph. So close your eyes now. Let the thrum of mill wheels lull you. Picture the soft shapes of wheat bending in twilight breezes, and feel the worn wooden handle of time resting snugly in calloused dreamers' hands. Sleep well, sour of thoughts. The field will still be here come morning.